The gym at Fairhaven Elementary smelled like crepe paper and hot glue, and Ren Merrick had checked the door so many times I'd started keeping count without meaning to. 14 times in about 10 minutes. She wasn't nervous about the dancing part. She'd told me twice already that dancing was, in her words, not really the point. She was nervous about the part right before it, the part where every other kid in the room walked in holding someone's hand, and she wanted to make sure hers was already taken care of. I told her for the 14th time that her mother's car was probably stuck behind the buses turning out of the lot. She nodded the way she nodded when she'd decided to be patient with an adult instead of correcting him, and went back to fixing the little enamel Ren pin I'd brought her, clipping and unclipping it on her collar until it sat exactly straight. Around us, other kids were doing versions of the same thing in different keys. A girl 2 tables over kept touching a plastic tiara like it might fall off if she stopped checking it. A boy near the punch bowl had already spilled something purple down the front of his shirt and looked prouder of that than bothered by it. Ren noticed none of it. She'd picked her chair specifically because it faced the doors, and she'd made me trade seats with her twice already to get the angle right. She'll find you no matter where you're sitting, I told her. That's not the point either, she said, with the flat certainty of someone who'd already thought this through more than I had. Then the double doors at the far end of the gym swung open, and I watched her whole face change before I even turned to see what she was looking at. There she is, Ren said, and she was moving before the sentence finished, weaving between folding chairs and a table of half-eaten cookies toward a woman standing just inside the doorway, scanning the room like she was hunting for exactly one face. She found Ren first. I watched her shoulders drop with the specific relief of a parent locating a kid in a crowd. Then her eyes slid past Ren, toward the man standing near the chair Ren had just left, and every bit of that relief vanished inside about half a second. She didn't come any closer right away, neither did I. The DJ had a song going with a bass line too big for a room full of 8-year-olds. Kids were spinning in slow circles under a string of paper lanterns somebody's committee had spent a weekend hanging, and in the middle of all of it, a woman I had never officially met in my life was looking at me like I'd stepped out of a photograph she'd put away a long time ago. Ren reached her and wrapped both arms around her waist, already talking, already pulling her forward, and the woman's hand came down to rest on her daughter's head on pure reflex, while her eyes stayed exactly where they'd landed. "Mom, this is Simon," Ren said. "He's my page partner." He came instead of. She caught herself the way kids do sometimes, right before a word leaves their mouth, deciding at the last second it isn't the right one to say out loud. It didn't matter. The woman had already covered half the distance between us, close enough now that I could see her hand wasn't quite steady around the strap of her bag. "Simon," she said, like she was testing whether saying it out loud would make it less true. There was no mistaking her. 12 years hadn't changed the particular way she said my name, careful and a little too flat, the way you handle something you don't trust yourself not to drop. I opened my mouth and nothing useful came out, because in 12 years I had pictured maybe 100 different versions of this exact moment, and not one of them took place under a balloon arch that said "Congratulations" in gold cursive, for an occasion that had nothing to do with either of us. She leaned in close enough that only I would hear it. "Out of everyone in this town," she whispered, "why did it have to be you?" "You guys know each other," Ren said, looking between us with the specific radar kids have, for the moment 2 adults stop making sense. Neither of us answered fast enough for that not to be its own answer. A teacher's aide near the stage called out that the photo line was forming, and the woman straightened the way people do when they need 1 extra second to arrange their face before the room sees it again. "We'll talk," she told me, quiet enough that it landed somewhere between a promise and a warning, and I genuinely could not tell which one she meant. Then she took Ren's hand and let her daughter pull her toward the photographer's backdrop, and I stood there under gold cursive letters, trying to remember the mechanics of breathing normally, while the question she'd just whispered to me sat lodged in my chest like something I'd swallowed wrong. 3 days earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday that gave no warning it was about to matter, none of that had happened yet, and I still believed I knew what my week looked like. My name's Simon Blake. I'm 35. I work as a pediatric occupational therapist at Maple Grove Children's Clinic on the edge of town, and my only real connection to Fairhaven Elementary was a laminated volunteer badge and a standing Tuesday lunch date with an 8-year-old who could identify 11 species of backyard bird by silhouette alone and had firm opinions about most of them. I was halfway through a session that Tuesday, kneeling on the floor of the therapy room, while a 6-year-old named Petey worked on getting a shoelace through its second loop, when my phone buzzed against the shelf behind me. I let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again a minute later, which at that extension usually meant something couldn't wait. So once Petey's shoe was tied, I stepped into the hallway and called the number back. "I have a strange favor to ask you," Diane Patterson said, and I could hear papers shifting on her desk while she talked. "The father-daughter dance is Friday. Wren doesn't have anyone to bring." She didn't need to explain past that. I already knew, the way you know certain facts about a kid without either of you ever discussing them out loud, that Wren's father had died a few years back. Something sudden, the kind of detail nobody had ever handed me more of than I needed to do my job well. I could put her at the craft table with the aides, while the rest of her class walks in on somebody's arm, Diane said. But I hate that option, and you're the one adult on our approved list she'd actually want to go with. You can say no. I didn't take more than a second. "I'm not saying no," I told her, and she let out a breath like she'd been braced for a longer negotiation than the one she got. "I've been doing this a year, and I've never met a single relative of hers," I said. "Is there anything I should know walking in?" "There's not much to know," Diane said, a little too quickly for it to be nothing, and I let it go because it wasn't my place to push a school counselor for details she wasn't offering. "Her mom works nights sometimes, and Grandma isn't always up for a school gym full of noise," Diane added, which is closer to an actual answer than I probably deserved. "Just be there by 5:30, in something that isn't scrubs, and you'll be fine." I told her I owned exactly one shirt that qualified, and I'd find it. I mentioned it to Theo Sandoval that afternoon, mostly because he was the only person at the clinic who'd actually met Wren, since he ran his own Tuesday sessions 2 grades over with a 4th grader named Dashiell, who found volcanoes to be the single funniest subject in the natural world. "A dance," Theo said, like I'd told him I was headed to the moon. "You, at a father-daughter dance. Does the kid know that the last time you tried to be part of somebody's family, you—" He stopped himself right there, because Theo had known me long enough to know exactly which sentences he was allowed to finish around me. And that one wasn't one of them. He let it drop and moved on to the thing that had actually been eating at him all week, which was that the district's budget subcommittee had put Page Partners on a short list for cuts, and the board would vote on it the Thursday before Thanksgiving. Under review was district language for "probably gone," and Theo, who had 2 years of seniority as a mentor and a healthy suspicion of anyone who used the word subcommittee without irony, was already planning to show up and make noise about it. 42 kids are in that program right now, he said, counting off on his fingers like the number itself was the argument. 42 kids who get 1 hour a week where some adult who isn't a parent or a teacher shows up just for them, on purpose, on the same day, every week. You cut that because a spreadsheet says it's not core curriculum, and nobody notices for a year, and then everybody wonders why the kids who needed it the most are the ones falling through. I told him I'd be there too. I had no idea yet how much that particular Thursday was going to matter, or that the woman from Friday night would end up 2 rows in front of me with a reporter's notebook open on her knee. The 2 days between the phone call and the dance went by the ordinary way most weeks do, except for one detail I kept circling back to without meaning to, which was that I had no picture at all in my head of who Ren's mother actually was, since every permission slip that had ever crossed my desk in a year came back signed by somebody named C. Merrick, a name I'd never had reason to put a face to. Some low background part of me, the part that still thought about a person I hadn't seen in 12 years more often than I would have admitted to anyone, kept hoping she'd turn out to be kind. By the time Friday actually arrived, I believed I was ready for whatever the night could throw at me. I was not ready for what happened 3 minutes after Claire Merrick walked through that gym door and told me, quiet enough that only I could hear it, that out of everyone in this town, it had to be me. The photo line took almost 20 minutes, long enough for me to half convince myself she might just leave the way she'd arrived, fast and without another word, taking Ren home to some explanation I wasn't going to be part of. She didn't. When the photographer released the last group of kids back into the noise of the gym, Claire found me near the drink table instead, and a friend of Ren's from her class had already pulled Ren toward a photo booth someone had set up with oversized paper glasses, buying the two of us a window neither of us had asked for. I've been replaying the last 5 minutes the whole time I was standing in that line, she said. No greeting first, no easing into it. I had a whole speech ready in the car, and none of it is coming out the way I practiced it. You don't owe me a speech, I told her. I know, she said. I still have one. Do you want it, or should I spare us both? Say it. Whatever it is, I'd rather hear it than spend the rest of the night guessing. She looked past me for a second, at Ren laughing under a paper crown 3 sizes too big, then back at me. I signed a permission form a year ago because Diane told me the reading program was good for kids who'd lost a parent, and I trusted her, and I never once thought to ask who S. Blake actually was. Why would I? When Diane called last week about the dance, I told her Ren could bring her page partner, the same person she sees every Tuesday. I trusted the program enough not to ask who that actually was this time either. I didn't either, I told her. Your form had C. Merrick on it. I had no reason to think that stood for anything I used to know. She almost laughed, the kind that isn't about anything being funny. 12 years, she said, and neither of us thought to double-check a name on a form. That's either very bad luck or something else, and I genuinely don't know which one scares me more. I didn't have a clean answer for that, so I didn't try to invent one. I told her the only true thing I had, which was that I hadn't known, and that I never would have let Ren spend a year of Tuesdays with me if I'd had any idea whose daughter she was. Not because I'd have minded, because Claire deserved the choice to decide that for herself, instead of finding out under a balloon arch. Her jaw tightened, not at me exactly, more at the whole situation stacking itself in front of her faster than she could sort it. I need you to understand something, she said. This isn't only about you and me. Ren has had one very hard year already. If she gets attached to a man who disappears the way people sometimes do, that's not your risk to take. That's hers, and I'm the one who has to be here after. I heard the accusation folded quietly inside that sentence, and for a second neither of us moved to unfold it any further. A mother from the punch table glanced our way twice in a manner that had nothing to do with punch, and Claire noticed her noticing, and something professional and armored slid down over her face for a second. The same look I imagined she wore walking into a school board meeting with a notebook in her hand. I'm not asking to be part of anything, I told her, once the woman had moved on. I'm asking not to be erased out of Ren's Tuesdays because this got complicated for the two of us. Claire's eyes stayed on me a beat too long before she answered. That's the part I haven't figured out yet, she said, whether those are actually two different things. Before I could answer, Ren came barreling back over in the paper glasses, breathless, wanting Claire to see the photo booth line before it got long. And the moment closed the way moments close when an 8-year-old decides it's time. Claire let herself get pulled a few steps away, then looked back once. "We're not finished," she said, and this time it sounded less like a warning and more like something she needed to be true. The following Tuesday, Wren set her bird book down halfway through our usual chapter and asked, no wind-up at all, if her mom and I were fighting. "Something like that," I told her. "Old business. Nothing you did." She studied me the way she studied illustrations she was trying to identify, like the answer was somewhere in the details if she looked long enough, decided I was telling the truth, and went back to her book. Claire showed up to get her early that afternoon, which had never happened in a year of Tuesdays, since pickup usually ran through the after-school program and a grandmother 2 towns over. She waited in the hallway instead of sending the office aide in, and when I stepped out, she didn't waste time getting to it. "You told me you'd come every weekend," she said. "You came for 6 of them. Then my mother had a bleed, and I called you and you didn't pick up, and after that you just stopped. I want you to know I'm not still angry at a boy who got scared and disappeared. I made my peace with that boy a long time ago. I'm asking because I watched my daughter run across a gym floor at you like you hung the moon, and I need to know if that's about to happen to her too." I opened my mouth and found I didn't have the whole thing ready, not in a hallway, not with an aide 2 doors down, and Wren visible through the window sorting index cards by color. "I didn't disappear on purpose," I said, which was true and not nearly enough. And her face told me she knew it wasn't enough before I did. "I was in an intensive clinical fellowship," I said, trying again. "There was a specific night I couldn't get to a phone. I'm not laying that out as an excuse. I'm telling you there's an actual explanation, and I'd like the chance to give you all of it, not the 4 sentences that fit in a school hallway." Claire's arms stayed crossed, but something in her posture eased a fraction, like she'd been braced to hear nothing at all and gotten more than that instead. "Not today," she said, "but not never." She didn't push further. She nodded once, the kind of nod that isn't agreement so much as a decision to set something aside for later, and went to collect her daughter. I went back to the clinic that afternoon and got through 2 more sessions before Theo found me in the supply room longer than the supply room usually required. "You're alphabetizing the therapeutic by color," he said, which is either a coping mechanism or a cry for help. I told him it was organizational efficiency, and let me keep believing that for about 4 more seconds before he asked straight out how the hallway thing had gone. "Not great," I told him. "She's not wrong to be careful." He leaned against the doorframe. "Being careful and being punished for something you actually did wrong are 2 different problems," he said. "You should probably figure out which one you're solving before you try to fix either." I spent the rest of that week organizing testimonials for the board meeting instead of sitting with how badly that conversation had gone, which Theo pointed out was, in his exact words, a very on-brand way for me to cope with an emotionally difficult Tuesday. The district's preliminary memo went out that same week, and Ellen Pruitt, who chaired the budget subcommittee, was quoted in it saying that enrichment programs, however well-intentioned, weren't core curriculum, and a district running an $11,000 shortfall couldn't keep funding things that felt good without proving they did anything measurable. $11,000 was, by more than one parent's math, less than the district had just spent resurfacing the football field's parking lot, and that particular comparison made its way around the Page Partners group chat within about an hour. I called the Fairhaven Weekly Gazette's front desk that Friday to ask if anyone covered school board budget stories regularly, mostly hoping to find a reporter worth talking to before Thursday, and the woman who answered told me their education beat had just been picked up by somebody new. Her name was Claire Merrick. She called me back herself 2 days later, and the first 10 seconds were awkward in a way that had nothing to do with the story and everything to do with neither of us having planned on hearing the other's voice again so soon. "Strictly professional," she said, before I could say anything. "I'm covering the board vote for the paper, and I'd like to interview a few mentors this week, you included, if that's not too strange given everything." "It's already strange," I told her, "so we might as well be useful about it." She laughed, short and real, and for the length of that laugh, the hallway conversation from Tuesday felt a little further away than it had all week. "Ask me the real questions first. Save the ones you actually need quotes for after." "There's a difference," she said. "Not really a question." "There is tonight," I told her, and she let that sit for a second before she moved on. We spent close to 2 hours on the phone. That was supposed to be 20 minutes, most of it about the program, some of it not. And near the end she asked, almost like an afterthought, whether I'd meant what I said about not knowing, about the form, about all of it. "I meant every word," I told her. "I still owe you the rest of the explanation." "Not tonight," she said, "but soon. I'm not asking you to earn anything. I just need to actually hear it once, start to finish, before I decide what to do with any of this." The turn came on the Tuesday before the vote, when Wren overheard 2 aides in the hallway talking about page partners possibly getting cut, and came back into our reading corner with her face already fighting not to crumple. "Is Tuesday going away?" she asked. And there was no version of that question I could answer with anything except the truth, which was that some grown-ups were trying to decide that very thing, and other grown-ups, myself included, were trying just as hard to make sure they decided wrong. She took that the way kids take most things adults can't fully control, which is to say, not well, and I walked her through 3 slow breaths before she'd pick her book back up. Claire arrived for pickup a few minutes later and found her daughter red-eyed over a chapter about barn owls, and something in her expression changed the second she understood why. She didn't say much in front of Wren. She waited until Wren was busy at the sink washing marker off her hands, and then, quieter than I'd heard her say anything yet, she asked me to actually tell her. The whole thing, the part she'd tabled in the hallway. So I did. I told her about the fellowship, an intensive clinical placement 3 states away, and about the specific night her mother had the bleed, when Claire called twice and I was in the middle of a hospital rotation I couldn't step away from, with a patient who needed me more than I could explain to anyone at the time, and by the time I got a break to call back, it was already morning and she didn't pick up. I told her about the number that stopped working a few months after that, and about driving out to her mother's old address the following spring, the first weekend I was free enough to make the trip, only to find a young couple loading moving boxes into a car that wasn't her mother's, with no forwarding address anyone on the block could give me. I told her I let it end there instead of trying harder, that I told myself a closed door meant she'd made her choice, when the truth was I hadn't fought for one more way to find her, because some part of me was relieved to have an excuse to stop trying. "That part's on me," I said. "Not the shift I couldn't leave. The stopping." Claire was quiet long enough that I thought she might not say anything at all. "That explains the silence," she finally said. "It doesn't explain why the boy who came for 6 weekends straight didn't find a way to come for the 7th, when it mattered most." "I know," I told her. "I don't have a version of this where I get to feel good about that part." She nodded slowly, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch. Not forgiveness exactly, but the specific relief of finally having the whole shape of a thing, instead of just the missing piece of it. "I'm not scared of you," she said after a moment. "I want to be clear about that. I'm scared of how easy it would be to let this matter again." She looked down at her hands for a second, turning her wedding ring, the one she still wore on her right hand now instead of her left, a habit she'd apparently settled on without ever explaining it to anyone who hadn't asked. "Adam was steady in a way you weren't, back then," she said. "He showed up early to things. He never once made me wonder. I built a whole life around a man who was the opposite of every reason I was scared of you. And then he died anyway. And some mornings I still can't believe that's allowed to happen to someone who did everything right. I didn't have anything smart to say to that, so I didn't try to say anything smart. I just told her I was sorry, and meant it in the plain, unglamorous way that doesn't fix a single thing, but is still true. The board met in the middle school auditorium the Thursday before Thanksgiving, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows facing a table where 5 members sat under fluorescent light that made everyone look a little more tired than they probably were. Ellen Pruitt opened the budget portion of the agenda by laying out the district's shortfall in plain, unemotional numbers, and made her case that programs without measurable academic outcomes should be first on the list, however popular they were with families. She wasn't cruel about it. She sounded like someone doing an unpleasant job as fairly as she knew how, which made her harder to argue with than a villain would have been. A grandmother named Ruth, who I recognized from drop-off but had never actually spoken to, went first, reading a short statement about her grandson from an index card her hands shook just slightly while holding. "He calls it his Tuesday," she said. "Not the program, not Page Partners. His Tuesday, like it belongs to him and nobody else does." Theo went next, talking about Dashiell's reading scores since September. Real numbers pulled straight from his teacher's own reports. I went after him and talked less about numbers and more about what I actually see in my clinic every week. Kids who've lost something stable at home and are hunting, consciously or not, for one more adult who shows up on the same day at the same time without fail, because consistency does something for a kid's nervous system that no worksheet can replicate. I finished by telling the board that Maple Grove Children's Clinic was prepared to sponsor $4,000 of the program's budget annually, starting immediately, since I'd already cleared it with my supervisor that week, and she'd said yes before I finished the sentence. Ellen Pruitt asked whether one clinic's goodwill was really a funding plan or just a way to postpone the same conversation next year. And I told her honestly that it was a start, not a solution, and that I'd rather hand the board a partial answer tonight than a perfect one a year from now when the program was already gone. She made a note of that without further comment. Then Claire stood up, and I watched her set down the reporter's notebook she'd been holding the entire meeting, a small, deliberate motion that made clear what came next wasn't going in the paper. "My name is Claire Merrick," she said, "and I'm covering tonight's meeting for the Gazette. But I'm also a parent, and I'm going to step outside my job for 1 minute to say something as one." She talked about her daughter, not by name at first, then by name, once, because she said Wren deserved to have her actual name attached to something true, instead of staying an anonymous example in someone else's testimony. She talked about the year her husband died, and the specific kind of silence that moved into their house afterward, and how one Tuesday a year ago, a volunteer she'd never met had started giving her daughter back an hour a week where she got to be a kid who identified birds instead of a kid whose father was gone. $11,000, Claire said, looking straight at Ellen Pruitt, is what this board is weighing against that. I understand the math. I'm asking you to weigh it against the other number too. When the vote came, it passed 4-1 to keep Page Partners fully funded for the rest of the year, with the clinic's sponsorship folded into next year's budget as a standing line item. Ellen Pruitt cast the one no, not out of spite, she said afterward, but because she still believed the district needed a longer-term funding plan than one clinic's good faith. A fair point that nobody in the room disagreed with, even the people who'd just won. The auditorium emptied out slowly, the way rooms do after something that mattered has just happened in them. And I found Claire in the parking lot, standing beside her car, with the notebook still unopened under her arm. "You didn't have to say her name," I told her. "You could have kept it general." "I know," she said. "I've spent 3 years keeping everything about her general and careful, because it felt safer than letting people see how much I actually have to lose." Tonight I just didn't want to do that anymore. We stood there a minute, without either of us filling the silence with anything, which was new, since every conversation we'd had in the last 2 weeks had been carrying something urgent. "This is the part where I'm supposed to have a whole plan," I said. "I don't. I just know I'd like the chance to actually be someone you and Ren can count on. Slowly, on your terms, without pretending 12 years didn't happen. I'm not asking you to forget the 7th weekend," I added. "I'm asking you to let me show up for the next 100 of them and see what that adds up to." Claire made a sound that was half a laugh, caught off guard by it. "That's a lot of weekends to promise a woman in a middle school parking lot," she said. "I know," I told her. "I'm not in a hurry to be right about it. I just don't want to be wrong about it twice." Claire looked at me a long moment, the kind of look that isn't deciding anything so much as finally letting itself feel something it had been holding at arm's length all week. "Slowly," she repeated. "On my terms. I can work with that." Then, quieter, almost to herself, "I spent 12 years telling myself the version where you just stopped caring, because that version was easier to be angry at than the real one. I don't know what to do with the real one yet." "That's fair," I told her. "Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere." We picked Ren up from Theo's fiancé's place on the way home, and she was half asleep in her booster seat by the time we pulled out of the driveway, mumbling something about Arctic terns she'd apparently learned about from a library book while we were gone. Somewhere around the second stoplight she surfaced just long enough to ask, to no one in particular, whether I had told her mom I liked her yet. And Claire nearly drove through a stop sign laughing, and I decided the honest answer could wait until Ren was actually asleep. By the time the first real snow came to Fairhaven in the second week of December, Tuesdays had changed shape without either of us deciding it out loud. Claire started arriving early instead of late, and some weeks she stayed for the last 15 minutes of the session, instead of waiting in the hallway, sitting on the little reading corner bench with her coat still on and her boots dripping slush onto a rug that had seen worse, while Ren read aloud from that same library book about Arctic terns, her enamel pin still clipped crooked to whatever she was wearing that day, because she'd decided crooked was actually the correct way to wear it, and no one had successfully argued her out of it. On one of those Tuesdays, Ren finished her chapter, closed the book with the specific satisfaction of a kid who has just learned a fact she plans to repeat to everyone she meets for the next week, and announced that Arctic terns fly farther than any other bird on Earth, from one end of the planet to the other and back again, every single year, without ever really landing anywhere for long. "That's basically you," Claire told her daughter, but she was looking at me when she said it. Ren didn't catch the second half of that sentence, already up and pulling her coat off the hook by the door, already narrating the rest of the tern fact to nobody in particular. Claire and I gathered our things and walked out together into the cold, Ren a few steps ahead kicking through the first thin layer of snow on the sidewalk. And somewhere between the school doors and the parking lot, Claire's hand found mine, the kind of ordinary gesture that would have felt impossible back in November, and felt like the easiest thing in the world now. "Out of everyone," she murmured, quiet enough that it was really only meant for me, an echo of what she'd whispered under the balloon arch a few weeks earlier. Except this time there was no accusation folded into it at all. "I'm glad it was you."